Certainly a rebuttal isn't called for at all, Matt. That was terrific. And I appreciate Alex's kind introduction. Aware that I thought and written about a bit Thomas L. Kane, my old friend Dick Bennett asked me to speak at this conference about Kane and his complex motives in visiting the Latter-day Saints in Iowa in 1846. I readily agreed, but with the understanding that I needed to provide context for this Iowa chapter in the Kane-Mormon relationship by touching on his subsequent work on behalf of the Latter-day Saints in Utah Territory during 1858, and of all places, New York City in 1859. Although no one knew it at the time, of course, Kane's mission to Iowa was not a standalone event. It was the beginning of a continuum of his interventions to help Mormons there and elsewhere. Why did Kane, a non-Mormon, come here in 1846? Although he'd studied in France and traveled in Europe, he had probably never been west of Pennsylvania. In a general sense, I suppose that I could explain his Iowa mission by pointing to his long interest in causes and reforms involving beleaguered people, slaves, prison inmates, and women, those whom the title of Matt's excellent book calls the downtrodden. He was what Dick Bennett, our resident authority on the Latter-day Saints in Iowa, has described as a, quote, idealistic 24-year-old lawyer looking for a cause, unquote. Aside from this generality, Bennett has looked for the specific answers to the why question and concluded that Kane was motivated by at least three additional factors. First, the strong approval and encouragement by his parents for what he hoped to do in Iowa. Secondly, a desire to explain to the world what the much maligned Latter-day Saints really were like. And third, a desire to ensure this group remained loyal to the United States as the Mexican War began, instead of migrating to the British possessions in the Pacific Northwest, such as Vancouver's Island. Accordingly, Dick has summarized Kane's initial motives in traveling to Iowa in July 1846 as a, quote, patriotic duty, a humanitarian goodwill gesture, unquote. Matt Grow has, of course, also thought a great deal about Kane's Iowa mission. In his biography, Matt writes about the altruistic motives that drove Kane, but he also discusses a self-promoting, manipulative side to this makeup. Matt writes that Kane's decision to visit the Latter-day Saints at the Missouri River was a calculating, perhaps even opportunistic one, rather than simply a selfless, impulsive act. Quoting Matt, quote, the Mormon refugee camps presented a humanitarian crisis that piqued Kane's sensibilities. Accordingly, he formed a scheme that mixed personal ambition and humanitarian sentiment. Travel to the Mormon camps also allowed Kane to act the part of a romantic hero who took decisive action and underwent danger on behalf of the oppressed, unquote. Preparing to leave for Iowa, Kane wrote Brother Elisha, and I'm here going to repeat a quote that Matt gave us a minute or so ago, because I think it's that important. Thomas told Brother Elisha that he hoped to, quote, to help the poor Mormons to my utmost principally, but also to help myself if I see anything outstanding. A very interesting insight into his motives. One avenue for such self-help was the possibility of writing a book about his adventures among the Mormons, one of which he proposed to a Philadelphia publisher before leaving for the West, and which he expected, as Matt phrased it, to, quote, vault him into public prominence and establish his reputation as a man of culture and reform, unquote. As a byproduct, Kane hoped to regain his health while in the West. After visiting President Polk to lobby for the enlistment of Mormon troops for the Mexican War and a presidential endorsement for his pending trip to Iowa, He bragged to Elisha that he had, as he phrased it, cowed Polk, and advised his brother, quote, "We too must not be meek and lowly if we seek to inherit this earth," unquote. Wow. Thomas's father, Judge John Kane, told Elisha his brother intended to, quote, "join the emigrants of whom he had become the champion, and to guide them," the father said, "Colts, revolvers in each hand, to the promised land as good dependents on the old 13 states. If he lives, he's on the way to usefulness and bright honors," unquote. At one point, while at Fort Leavenworth, before meeting with the Mormons, Kane temporarily thought that he might have to abandon his mission. Tellingly, he lamented to his father, quote, "Adieu, book, honor, money, everything I hoped," unquote. Among the plans he thought he would have to abandon were his aspiration to be what he called, quote, "the man of the American West, one destined to carry with me the tide of civilization," unquote. There's evidence that once he reached the Mormons in Iowa, he fantasized about accompanying them to California, where, upon the defeat of Mexico, they would help to install him as the first American governor. The discovery that Brigham Young intended to head for the Great Basin rather than the Pacific coast was a disappointment, but one from which he characteristically rebounded to resolve that he would help the Mormons over the long run wherever they migrated. In turning from the complex subject of Kane's motives in going to Iowa, I'll simply say that several behaviors emerged from this episode to be repeated 10 years later in Utah. Some of them were less than selfless and formed a behavioral pattern evident during the rest of his life. It's a little difficult to sort out which of these were drivers that initially prompted Kane to go west, and which were other tendencies arriving once he was in Iowa and saw possibilities for action that went beyond his original motives. I refer to these 7. Delusions of grandeur, including exaggeration of his influence and importance. Plans for obtaining national publicity through publication of a book or similar venue. Less than careful use of his family's limited funds. A need for association with the President of the United States to obtain his written endorsement to impress others and force his way through obstacles. Personality conflicts, even challenges to duel. Obsessive secrecy, including the encryption of messages intended for the president. Perceptions of reality that often varied from those of others. The trek to Utah, 1858. After 10 years of continued controversy involving the Latter-day Saints and Kane's great disillusionment with the church's announcement of plural marriage in 1852, which Matt described so well, why did he persist in his support for what Brigham Young liked to call this people? Why did he do what we know he did in Utah Territory during 1858? On one level, there was, of course, a great need. It was a bit like the response of one British mountain climber when asked in the 1930s why he wanted to climb Mount Everest. The climber replied, "Because it's there," unquote. Once in Utah, Brigham Young and the Mormons were again in trouble. In early January 1857, even before Buchanan took office, Brigham Young wrote to Kane asking him, in effect, to lobby for his reappointment to a new term as governor. Kane swung into action after Buchanan's March 1857 inauguration, prompting Apostle John Taylor to report to Brigham Young from New York, quote, "He has written to the president and also to Judge Black, Attorney General of the U.S., in relation to Utah, urging your reappointment. How it will turn out, he says he cannot at present determine, but he'll do his best and use his utmost endeavors and influence for you and the welfare of Utah. His feelings are good," unquote. Kane failed in this attempt. The president believed that the leadership of Utah was in poor hands and was determined to appoint a new governor. Worn out from the effort, ailing, and disillusioned with Buchanan, Kane reported all this to Young by mail and withdrew to the mountains of western Pennsylvania to regain his health. I think it's important to point out at this juncture, the spring of 1857, that Brigham Young had not asked Kane to come to Utah for purposes of mediating his troubled relationship with the US government. For that matter, at no time in 1857 did Young do so, a fact perhaps surprising to many people, as it was to me when I first realized the extent to which during this period, Kane was navigating solely by his own internal compass, and doing so in the face of opposition for virtually his entire family. In October 1857, Kane returned from Western Pennsylvania to Philadelphia. There, he became aware of the U.S. Army's Utah expedition and its westward march with a new governor in tow. Furthermore, in his office, he found a letter that Brigham Young had written in August and couriered east to brief Kane on his war aims. On September 12, Young wrote to Kane again, making clear that he viewed Kane's greatest potential service as one of remaining in the East to stay the hand of the Buchanan administration. In this letter, Young did tender Kane a somewhat indirect invitation to move west eventually, but not for purposes of mediation. Brigham Young wrote, quote, "We feel that we can rely upon your aid and influence in averting what he called their fearful storm. But if it breaks upon us, it will also break upon the whole country, and then friends will be friends in need. Where will you find better, warmer, or more sincere friends than in the mountains?" Unquote. We, of course, know that Kane did go to Utah, as well as the details of his remarkable 6,000-mile round trip between Philadelphia and Utah during January through June 1858. But again, we need to examine why he did this. From my research, I conclude that the motives behind his trip, behind that Utah mission, were quite different than those involved with the Iowa trip, although there were some ways in which they were similar. The differences sprang from the fact that in the interval between the two missions, the political dynamics of the Mormon federal relationship had changed considerably. Also, Kane had married and become the father of two small children. He was 10 years older and more mature. He and the family had sustained a tremendous psychological blow in February 1857 with the death of Elisha Kane, and his parents were adamantly opposed to any trip to Utah. All of these factors were in play when Kane returned to Philadelphia in October 1857 to find the Utah expedition on the move across the Great Plains. Fortunately, we know a lot more about what was on Kane's mind at that time because he confided many of his inner thoughts to his wife, who of course was not on the scene in 1846. During 1857-58, Elizabeth Kane kept an extensive diary of her conversations and correspondence with Thomas. After he returned from Utah, the couple began to write narrative accounts of his experiences in hopes, never realized, of publishing them for financial gain. Both types of documents are of great value to understanding Thomas's motives, although historians need sensitivity to the tendency of both Kanes to stray into the realm of fantasy while recording what they represent as fact, perhaps to tell an exciting story appealing to potential readers. Alarmed by a combination of Brigham Young's urgent messages, rumors of bloodshed in Utah, and Army reports of Mormon determination to resist its Utah expedition, Kane traveled to Washington on November 9, 1857, to meet with President Buchanan. The timing was important. Only 4 weeks before Buchanan would need to speak publicly for the first time about Utah affairs in his annual message to Congress, what we now call the State of the Union Address. Kane later described his November visit to the White House as inconclusive, with Buchanan troubled but, quote, reluctant to admit that he had committed any error, unquote, in sending the troops. Several years later, Kane claimed that in this session, the president proposed, quote, to appoint me to proceed to Utah, unquote, but that he managed to, as Kane called it, evade it on grounds that it, quote, was too late in the season for me to force my way among the Mormons, unquote. In retrospect, Kane wrote sheepishly about that period, quote, I will admit I was sufficiently recreant a citizen to congratulate myself upon not having the responsibility put upon me of refusing the president to make an effort at that time to save the administration and the country. When Kane returned again to Philadelphia from Washington in his visit in the White House and found the newspapers filled with the disturbing news of conflict in Utah, he grew more alarmed. Quote, my thoughts turning after this to Utah matters and examining fully into the subject, the conviction gained upon me that I was perhaps leaving undone that which I ought to have done, unquote. He concluded that it would indeed be possible to reach Salt Lake City, notwithstanding the onset of winter weather. On December 8, 1857, Buchanan sent his annual message to Congress, expressing his intent to suppress by force what he considered a rebellion in Utah, and requesting authorization of more regiments to do it. The next day, one of his principal political advisors urged Buchanan to meet again with Kane to explore his growing desire to serve at his own expense as an intermediary to resolve the Utah War. The advisor described Kane as, quote, full of courage, and if his judgment is correct about his influence with Brigham Young, he may be able to avert a war of extermination against a poor, deluded race, unquote. Such a White House meeting did take place. It occurred immediately after Christmas, with Kane expressing a determination to go to Utah at all costs, and Buchanan advising against such a mission because of hazards from weather and possibly hostile Latter-day Saints. The president, in effect, washed his hands of any responsibility or sponsorship for what Kane wanted to do, but gave him several tepid letters fundamentally wishing him well while introducing him to any federal officers that he might meet on the trip. In early January 1858, Kane left for Utah by way of New York, Panama, and Southern California. He did so with the reluctant acquiescence of his parents, but the active support of wife Elizabeth. She recognized that Thomas viewed such a mission as a calling, and Elizabeth hoped that performing it would bolster his recent acceptance of Christianity at her urgings after a life of agnosticism. From the distance of Paris, Kane's brother John tried to explain to the family why he believed Thomas was going to Utah. John wrote, quote, Tom is never so well as when exposed to what would kill most men of his build. And that hard life in open air, no matter how hard, always agrees with him better than the most tranquil of sedentary existence. At home, Tom's big soul was preying on his body, John wrote. The loss of dear Elisha and the crushing blow which this national financial crisis gave to his hopes of organizing a new expedition to the Arctic were killing him by inches. He's too great a man to occupy himself with trifles. Now, by going to Utah, he has got an object large enough and enough to get his thoughts away from the poor self on which they were fading. And I can't help hoping that his physical man will approve in consequence. However be the result of what it may be, the object is grand and noble and does him and the family honor. This may well have been the case, on one level at least, but other documentation shows that probably an even more influential driver behind Kane's Utah mission was his desire to prevent further bloodshed, such as in September at Mount Rose. What reinforced his desire was his belief that he could make a difference in Utah through exercise of his personal influence and powers of persuasion. Elizabeth Kane ventured several missions of her own of her husband's motives. Years later, she attributed Thomas's persistent need to bound off on such distant missions with the whimsical thought that he, quote, has a great horror of growing old and wants to die out of sight, so that I'll remember him as the ideal hero who won my child's heart and not see him grow old. We're back to Matt's reference to the two having married when 16 years old. But she knew there was a more serious reason for the trip. Kane's edgy about violence rooted in his mistaken belief that the Utah expedition was outmatched, with Brigham Young supposedly powerful enough to annihilate it. Before heading west, he told Elizabeth that, quote, if the Mormons overwhelmed the little US Army and camped there, they in turn would inevitably be overwhelmed, crushed out of existence by a nation bent on vengeance, unquote. Once in California in February 1858, he restated these fears, writing to Judge Kane, quote, I cannot honorably reveal even to you, my father, the Army's peril. Had you done all, you would not have opposed my coming here. The day may be, and probably is past, to make peace, but not to save our poor Army fellows. Have no fear for my life. The biblical cloud and pillar will be my escort. I swear I will arrive in Utah in time, unquote. After having met with Brigham Young in Salt Lake City and then moved on to be with the Army at Fort Bridger, he wrote his father with cavalier bravado and the presumption that he held powers of life and death, quote, my private news for you, well, the troops are saved, at least until I wave my handkerchief, unquote. There are signs that Kane's mission to Utah also sprang from more complex psychological needs. Kane told President Buchanan in December 1857 that in going to Utah, he was seeking to, as he phrased it, prove himself. After he returned home from Utah, Thomas told Utah's territorial delegate in Congress, quote, he would have the world know that he made his journey at his own expense in the interest of the whole United States and of humanity, as well as the friends he loves in Utah, unquote. Given these drivers and motives, how did Kane plan to execute his intent once he reached Utah? Without going into all that happened, I'll simply say that his mission was surprisingly unplanned with a high reliance on improvisation. After the Civil War, Elizabeth captured this tone in writing, quote, Tom's plan was to go in disguise to Utah by way of California, winter though it was, and to make his unexpected appearance at Young's very gates, relying upon his own mental force and Young's knowledge of the sincerity of his goodwill to the Mormons. He actually intended to turn a whole people's will and make them ask for peace in the hour of their triumph over the Army, unquote. When Kane traveled to Iowa in 1846, Brigham Young knew he was coming, although the two men had never met. But in early 1858, even though the two were close friends by then, Young had not asked Kane to come to Utah and had no idea that he was doing so until he arrived in Salt Lake City on February 25th of 1858. Lecture in New York, 1859. My last piece of context for Kane's Iowa mission runs to a high-profile lecture that he gave at the New York Historical Society on March 21st, 1859. It was titled, The Executive of Utah. In brief, it was a talk that Kane delivered after stimulating an invitation to speak to support the incumbency of Governor Alfred Cumming, Brigham Young's successor. With calculating intent, the lecture came at a time when Cumming was politically beleaguered and likely to be removed by office by President Buchanan, who had appointed him less than 2 years earlier. Running out of time somewhat, I'll just simply say that the tactics associated with Kane's New York lecture worked, as had those he had earlier employed in Iowa and Utah itself. The national publicity that Kane arranged for the talk, with the help of Mormon apostle George Q. Cannon and the New York-based Associated Press, stayed Buchanan's hand. By June 1859, Kane was back at the executive mansion at the president's invitation to discuss Utah. and Alfred Cummings served out his gubernatorial term until the Civil War began. For those interested in the full story of Kane's gambit in Manhattan, I refer you to an article that I have coming out in a few months in the fall issue of Utah Historical Quarterly. This piece is titled Saving the Governor's Bacon, Thomas L. Kane's Political Defense of Alfred Cumming, 1859. In writing earlier about Thomas L. Kane's mission to Iowa, Dick Bennett discussed not only his motives in going there, but how and why this adventure developed into a profound, lifelong respect for and admiration and friendship with the Latter-day Saints. Among the 5 explanations Dick offered for this phenomenon, one especially caught my attention: the growth, beginning in 1846, of a sense of mutuality and reciprocity. As Kane explained it to a Mormon group in 1850, quote, "I have known too that my feelings were reciprocated and that you have all along felt towards me as I have felt towards you," unquote. One gets a sense for this rapport and what drove Thomas to help the Latter-day Saints when he visited Utah for the second time in the winter of 1872-1873, the trip to which Matt referred. This time he arrived on the Transcontinental Railroad and did so at Brigham Young's invitation, accompanied by Elizabeth and their 2 sons. In St. George, a settlement that did not exist when he first passed through southern Utah 15 years earlier, he visited, among others, Augusta Joyce Crochron. In 1858, as a 13-year-old girl, she and her parents had provided aid and comfort to Kane in the face of an anti-Mormon mob in San Bernardino. Shortly after Kane died in 1883, Augusta, by then a grown woman and plural wife, described the dramatic end of his visit to the family's home in St. George 10 years earlier. She wrote, quote, "Looking from the doorway on the light within and the stormy night without, he said, 'This looks like our political horizon. Stay you in camp, eat roast beef and rest. I will go out in the storm and stand picket guard for you.' He extended his hand, repeated thrice, 'Good night,' and was gone," unquote. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Matt and Bill. Bill, it's good to see you. We haven't seen you for a while, so we're glad you're doing well and made a wonderful contribution with your paper. Those were great comparisons and insights to these, to Thomas Kane and Brigham Young, and of course the differences between the visit, Kane's visit here in 1846 and his one in 1858. I really, really enjoyed their papers and look forward to them publishing those. We have plenty of time, actually. I think we have about 20 minutes for questions to either or both of our participants today. John, help me out. Do we have, can I answer, how do I see those questions? Can you see these questions, Bill and Matt? The first one says, how do you access the noontime virtual, oh, not that one. I don't see.
Okay, so no question there.
You don't have any questions virtually here?
No, I'm not seeing questions, Alex.
Okay, well, we'll take them from our group here, but I don't see how they can submit them from the virtual audience. So we'll just take them here in our room here today. Are there questions here? And we need to probably repeat them.
Yes.
Okay. Do we have any?
When did Kanesville become Council Bluffs?
When did Kanesville become Council Bluffs? We could direct that to anyone, and Dick can fill in.
That sounds like a Dick Bennett question.
Okay, Dick answered 1853. Dick, do you want to, maybe, we probably need to have you come up or something. After George Miller, first called Miller's Hollow after George Miller. Henry Miller, excuse me. Okay, I don't know if you could hear that, Matt or Bill. Okay, I'll just try to summarize. So first of all, named after Henry Miller, Miller's Hollow, and then in 48, it became Kanesville, and then 53, it was changed to Council Bluffs. Very good. And of course, even before the Mormons were here, it was the Bluffs, wasn't it? Didn't they refer to it as the Bluffs? Just the Bluffs. Yeah. Okay, very good. Question? Okay, Alan asked the question, then why did they name it Kanesville? Was it because Kane came here in 1846? Or was it just because of their love and appreciation to him, Dick? Is that, I'm guessing that's what I've always thought. And kind of to honor him for his efforts to try to help the Latter-day Saints. And we were the majority of the population here, so. Good. Others, please. Did Thomas L. Kane ever join the church? Either one of you want to comment on that?
He didn't.
I think that grows in part out of the American love of conspiracy theories. And I think there's also been confusion over his baptism for health in Iowa when he was so sick in 1846. The patriarch of the church administered a blessing on him on his, what was almost his deathbed at the time. And of course, as you all know, he recovered and was immensely grateful for it. But many people chose to interpret that later as a joining of the church in the traditional sense, and it wasn't, as Matt has just described. But that has kind of plagued that question ever since. People just couldn't just stay away from it. When he came back from Utah, for example, or even before he got back from Utah, it was so prominent that his brother, Pat, went to Washington to see President Buchanan and asked him to please put out the word that Thomas had not joined the church in going to Utah. And Buchanan said that he would immediately do that. He took a pen and scribbled a note and sent it off to the editor of the Washington Union. And it wasn't quite as pointed as what Pat had wanted, but basically you had the President of the United States denying on behalf of the family that Thomas was out in Utah as a convert.
Thank you, Bill. Do you want to say anything on that, Matt?
The only thing I'd add, just an interesting footnote, is that there was a lot of suspicion, as Bill is saying, during Kane's life, that he had secretly converted. But a year after his death, George Q. Cannon, who by that time is a member of the First Presidency, he was Kane's closest friend at the time of Kane's death in 1883, closest friend among the saints. He takes Kane's name to the temple and performs a vicarious baptism for him. So if anyone would have known if Thomas Kane had been secretly baptized in the church, it would have been George Q. Cannon, and then he wouldn't have done the vicarious baptism for him. So that's just an interesting footnote.
Oh, those are both great insights there. Thank you very much.
One question. Given what we've been told about Kane's own sense of destiny and significance, is there any documentation as to his reaction to
hear that question, Bill, or?
No,
Matt?
no, I couldn't.
Well, given his distinction as being, as this Kanesville being named after him, is there, how did you say it again? Yeah, how he felt about having that honor of being renamed or named by the Mormon community. Is there any thoughts there, how he felt about that?
Matt, anything that come to your mind?
No, I think I think there's something in one of the letters to Brigham Young. I mean, I think he's honored by it and says, says thank you. But I don't know that we know anything beyond that.
I haven't come across anything, but I know that years later, when Thomas and Elizabeth started to develop the Kane family holdings of hardwood timber in northwestern Pennsylvania, that the little community that grew up in McKean County was dubbed Kane, as it is today. It's still Kane, Pennsylvania. I can't believe that Thomas didn't have a hand in that. And so I'm going to assume that he was quite pleased to have Iowa sporting a town called Kanesville for a while. I don't know that because of any explicit documentation, but based on his behavior and the creation of Kane, Pennsylvania, I'm going to guess that he was pleased by the honor in Iowa.
Yeah, Kane is kind of an interesting mix of, I think a lot of his identity is built in terms of operating behind the scenes. So he drafts newspaper articles that appear under pseudonyms, and he sees himself as this kind of behind the scenes operator. But he was also definitely pleased, as Bill is saying, that the town was named after him, and pleased when he got his moments in the sun as well.
The behavior that Matt's just described is what Brigham Young called wire working. That is the manipulation of things, almost like puppetry, behind the scenes with wires.
Yeah,
I guess that's where the phrase "it's all been wired" came from. It may have preceded the creation of electrical devices that we all know today. It may go back to the 19th century at least.
yeah.
Very interesting. I should note, and many of you know, in Utah we have Kane County. I don't remember when that was actually organized. It's a county, extreme southern end of Utah, and the county seat is Kanesville. So obviously we were still honoring and I'm not saying obliging, but I guess that's kind of what it was too, the services of Thomas Kane at that point as well. So I can't remember when it was organized. I'm wondering if it was even, I can't think of anyone down there at the time, but maybe somebody could Google.
I just refreshed my memory on that, Alex. It's organized in 1864 by the Utah legislature.
Oh, okay.
I don't think there's many people down there, but it is organized during Kane's lifetime.
Okay, that was much of an honor as well to do that. Thank you. The question was, did they name it Kane before it was called Kanesville? Any ideas on that, or Dick? It just probably originated with Kanesville, I guess. So, good. We'll go with Dick. Okay, Dick asked the question, could you comment just a little bit about Kane and his relationship with his famous brother?
I'll say just a word or two. So Kane's brother Elisha was just a huge figure in the 1850s. I think a pretty apt comparison that someone else has made is that to be an Arctic explorer in the 1850s was like being an astronaut in the 1960s. you were going where no one else had gone before, and the news followed you and publicity followed you. And Elisha's the older brother, and I think Thomas, I mean, they are really close. Thomas really looks up to him. And Thomas plays a key role in kind of making his brother who he becomes after his brother comes back from the Arctic. I mean, it's not just enough to go to the Arctic. You have to let people know that you went to become the hero. And Thomas is working behind the scenes to promote his brother, writing articles. He helps draft Elisha's book on his Arctic expeditions. And then Elisha dies in 1857, and so he's kind of frozen in time, right? I mean, a hero who dies at the height of his popularity, and so we always just cast this huge shadow, I think, over Thomas's life. What would you add, Bill?
You're absolutely right. And one of the ways in which Thomas also did that in terms of, quote, making Elisha's image after he died was to prevent scandal from sullying it.
Yeah.
Elisha had been carrying on a very problematic relationship with one of the Fox sisters, who were the most notorious of the spiritualists in the country at the time. And there were all kinds of letters passed between Elisha and Miss Fox. And without going into the details, Thomas and his brother Pat and the rest of the family spent a lot of time after Elisha's death making sure that this scandal didn't bubble up to the public's awareness, although there were rumors of it. Elisha also did something for Thomas after his death, and I'm not going to stray into psychohistory, but someone could do a very interesting study on the impact of the example of what Elisha did on Thomas. Elisha, as a naval surgeon during the Mexican War, carried dispatches from General Winfield Scott to Mexico City. Does that sound a little familiar? In March of 1857, as I mentioned in the quote from John Kane from Paris, Thomas wanted the family to endorse and financially support an expedition of his to go to the Arctic to further the scientific discovery work that Elisha had started, first to try to find Sir John Franklin's lost expedition and then to explore the region. This was before going to Utah was on the screen. And so the example of what his brother had done and his fame spilled over into Thomas's motives in a lot of the adventures that he took on. When Matt described the extent of Elisha's fame, he certainly didn't understate it. Tom went to Havana with Elisha after Elisha came back from the Arctic with broken health. And the hope was that in Havana, he would recover during the winter of 1856-57. He didn't. He died in, I think, January or February, I forget which. But the funeral cortege for bringing Elisha's body from Havana to the cemetery in Philadelphia, through New Orleans, Louisville, Cincinnati, up into Pennsylvania, was the most extensive funeral cortege in the United States between the death of George Washington and the death of Abraham Lincoln. The country had never seen anything like it other than the mourning for George Washington. So there were lots of examples in which Thomas was seeking to live up to his brother, whether that was brotherly emulation or rivalry. I'm not skilled enough in the world of psychology to know, but it's a factor that you can't totally abandon. So the relationship between the two brothers carried over into death, beyond death, in multiple ways. Thomas trying to help Elisha, and Elisha's example motivating Thomas in ways that we still don't fully understand.
That's excellent. Thank you so very, very much. We have time for any more, just one or two more questions. I'm sorry, go ahead, Alan. Okay, the question is to you, Bill, how Kane used the word, or you used the word delusions of grandeur, and could you elaborate on that phrase and its meaning to Kane?
That was my phrase, of course, not Thomas's
Okay, sorry.
phrase.
All right.
That was my homemade assessment of what I was seeing, but he had thoughts of things that he could do and accomplish, and sometimes they went beyond what was realistic. Sometimes he would invent all kinds of things, and that's a part of those delusions. There's a lot of controversy over what did Kane and President Buchanan really say to one another in December of 1857 when Thomas went to the White House on Christmas Day to talk about his mission to Utah. Kane later wrote that Buchanan had in effect created him as a official but unannounced peace commissioner of the type that Buchanan appointed in April of 1858 to actually go to Utah. He wrote that Kane had given him, that Buchanan had given him the power to extend pardons to individual Mormons if he thought on the spot, once he got to Utah, that it was warranted. Elizabeth picked up a lot of those types of comments that Thomas made and included them in her diary. And that's the problematic area of fact versus fiction and fantasy. And in many cases, the fantasy ran to the assumption of powers and authorizations that others argued really didn't happen. The delusion of grandeur, in a way, even carried over into kind of the material culture area. In his letters to Pat, his brother Pat Kane, Thomas wrote from Fort Bridger about how grandly outfitted he was and how he had the best furs of anybody in Fort Bridger. These furs, by the way, had been made at the Las Vegas mission by Mormon women who felt sorry for him as he was passing east going for Salt Lake City in February of 1858. And Thomas bragged to his brother how he had the best furs at Fort Bridger and the best firearms and the best horse. Captain Phelps of the U.S. Artillery, who was at Fort Bridger, noted in his diary that when Kane fell off of his horse and had to be carried to the tent of Captain Robinson of the 5th Infantry to spend the night before he went to see Albert Sidney Johnston and Alfred Cumming, that Kane was attired with a red sash around his waist. I mean, his outfit was splendid, and he bragged about it. That was part of the romantic flavor and dramatic flavor. When he gave his talk in Philadelphia before the Pennsylvania Historical Society in 1850 about the Mormons on behalf of the Mormons, he was carried into the speaking hall on a door that had been unhinged, carried as a stretcher on a door to make his talk. I mean, there was a high degree of showmanship, flamboyance, and the theatrical, and assumptions of what he could do and what he could accomplish. Like you recall the phrase I used of waving his handkerchief. In effect, he told his father that if he waved his handkerchief, Brigham Young would descend on and annihilate the Utah expedition. I don't think that was quite a realistic assessment of his powers. First of all, I don't think Brigham Young would have done it solely on a wave of Thomas Kane's handkerchief. And secondly, I don't think there would have been an annihilation. But that's the best I can offer by way of explaining why I use that phrase.
Thank you, Bill. One more quick question, just from me. Maybe just could either one of you talk or both just really discuss his illness? He always seemed to be rather sickly, kind of fragile. any thoughts what he was experiencing physically, medically, whatever?
You, he does seem to be prone to physical illnesses throughout his life. I mean, there's just a whole string of them, including probably the malarial fevers that were at the Latter-day Saint camps in 1846, and there's a string of serious injuries during the Civil War that really leaves him a physical wreck after the war. And of course, there's anytime you do biography, you are dealing partly with psychology, and it's difficult to know what's the interplay between the mental and the physical in terms of these illnesses. Is there a kind of an obsessive or hypochondriac kind of element to them, or is it just I had an interesting experience a few years after I wrote the book, and in the book I talk about that Thomas is quite open with what he calls his blue devils, by which he means he has depressive episodes. And a descendant of Thomas Kane called me, and he was passing through Salt Lake City and wanted to get together and talk. And this descendant was a professor of psychology at a university in California. And he said, I've given a lot of thought to the Kane family over time and our various physical and mental, the interplay between the two. And he's like, he shared with me that his diagnosis of Thomas would be that, like many members of the Kane family through time, he said he thinks that Thomas had a bipolar element to his personality, where you had these periods of depression, which I think are very clear in the record, but also periods of kind of frantic action, right? And he'd experience these high highs and these low lows. And like I said, neither Bill nor I are psychologists, and his descendant, doesn't have access to Thomas to diagnose him either. But there's just complex, I think, psychological things going on here, as well as real physical things that he suffers through life.
It's an excellent question that was asked, and Matt's answer was more than equal to it. I throw in the notion that someone could do a wonderful study of the physical and mental health implications of not only Thomas L. Kane, but Brigham Young. Brigham Young had many mysterious illnesses, often during times of stress. I mean, immediately after the death of Jedediah Grant in December of 1856, Brigham Young was out of commission for weeks. And when the Utah War started, he was not at the top of his game, nor was James Buchanan for that matter. But all during his lifetime, when critical moments arose, Brigham Young was often afflicted by mysterious illnesses, not quite clear what it was. In fact, there's a lack of clarity on what it was he died from, although no doubt that he did. But maybe Matt will do a study of the medical and mental health condition of these two friends and leaders. It's a wonderful area to explore, and significant because it did impact on what happened to them. It's especially noticeable in Kane's case, but it's there for Brigham Young. Most people go by it because has an image of vigor and enormous responsibility and accomplishment in the West, but he often did it as a fairly sick man.
Yeah, just one quick thought on Brigham. I mean, of course, we all know that people today often live in chronic pain. I think people in the 19th century, so many of them, and I think Brigham for decades lived in chronic pain. I mean, I think there's good elements, and then there's these questions that Bill is raising about the psychological as well. But the rheumatism that Brigham deals with, at least for the last couple of decades of his life, I just leaves him with chronic pain, and so then you kind of wonder, well, how does that interact with his leadership and his ministry and all those kind of questions. It's a great question, Bill.
When Thomas was in a blue, I forget the term, Matt used, I'll call it a blue fog or a blue funk,
Yeah.
in September of 1858, after coming back from Utah and being sort of ignored by President Buchanan. What pulled him out of it was a letter that his father-in-law, Mr. Wood, Elizabeth's father, wrote to him, reminding him of all that he had accomplished. And it's, I think, what we should leave the subject of Thomas Kane on, in terms of, notwithstanding all of his complexities and maybe some warts, he accomplished amazing things, as did Brigham Young. And Mr. Wood reminded Thomas in detail about how arduous the mission was that he had undertaken to go to Utah, how significant it was, and that he should think about it and take solace in what it was he had accomplished. And that sort of did the trick for Thomas at that particular juncture.
Thanks so much, Bill and Matt. This has been so stimulating, and we really appreciate both of your insights and comparisons today. And so on behalf of all of us here and the 31 online, we thank you very much.